Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helper Parker, and with me I've got Doug Braun-Harvey, continuing our series for the Principles for Healthy Sexuality. And today we are going to talk about the concept of having shared values. And this is a really interesting topic for me because this is where I think a lot of my conversations go with my clients is about their values and all the many ways that can be conflated with other things. So I'm super excited to talk about this. I've got lots of notes already to ask you about. And I would love to have you just start us off with a conversation about how you would initially start talking about this particular principle.
When I teach about this principle, the first thing I talk about is that human beings are thought of to be the only mammals who, when they have sex, it has meaning. So in other words, when dolphins mate and they're swimming around the next day, I don't think that one of the dolphins thinks about the other one, oh, I hope he still loves me.
We don't know, right?
We don't know. But one thing we do know for sure is that this is true about Homo sapiens. Our sexual activity, our sexual fantasies, our sexual desires, our sexual interests all have meaning. To us, to other people, to society, to government, to religion, lots and lots of places and institutions and people have an investment in what sexual behavior and sexual activity means. And that's just a reality of sexual life between human beings.
You know, it's so interesting, as you say, government entities, the term family values came up for me. You know, we hear that a lot in political discussions, and so much of that is in the sexual context. I don't think that when we think of family values, we're thinking about, well, do we have programs to help kids not cheat on their ACT exams, right? Or do we have programs to help people not fall into money laundering types of habits?
That's right. You're so right. Well, again,
we're talking about abortion. We're talking about premarital sex. We're talking about sexual education. We're talking about homosexuality and gay rights. And I mean, those are the quote unquote family values that come up.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the things that also I think is really important when talking about values and sexuality is specificity and very clear and articulate language. I think one of the ways values gets confounded with emotional disgust is when we don't use really specific words and clear language about what we're talking about. So what you're describing is when we're in the realm of values, we're in the realms of evoking the disgust response in people. And the emotion of disgust is not the same as a sexual value.
Yeah, that's interesting. So can you go into that a little bit more? Because I think when people think of disgust, if something disgusts me, then that probably means it doesn't fall into my values. But you're saying those are actually two different things.
They can be. That's right. One is an emotion and one is a thought. A value comes from ideas and notions and creeds and it comes from the deliberative aspect of being human. The disgust response is one of the emotions we're born to be able to have. The infant in the first breath of life is able to experience disgust, and they have to, so that they don't get fed food that'll kill them. So it conveys the disgust, which you might be poisoning me. It's one of the most primitive feelings we have. But people will confuse the activation of disgust as meaning that must be against my values, or that must be a wrong, or that must be morally questionable. And I think we have to kind of parse those things out and help people parse those things out.
I talk a lot about this in webinars and seminars that I do with people, just helping them get out of their comfort zones, around their sexuality. So for example, I give the example that French kissing was kind of disgusting to me when I first heard about it. Right? So,
Yeah.
I was about 10 years old, and I'm like, people do what? That sounds like a really gross, disgusting thing to do. So yeah, it would have been very easy to say, well, then that's just wrong. That's just a wrong thing to do. Why would people do that? That's immoral or questionable or, perverse, or all these kind of words that have a lot of morality meaning associated with them. And then, of course, by the time I was 15, I had changed my mind on that quite drastically. But
I'm so happy for you,
Natasha.
Are you happy for me? I'm happy for you.
But, and we could all laugh and giggle about that. But when you think about things like anal sex, when you think about BDSM, when you think about kink, when you think about maybe sexuality within an orientation you're not comfortable with or have certain values around those things, you can see how it gets a little bit more complex, especially if there are things you're not interested in or assume you're not interested in, but maybe your partner is. So this gets tricky pretty quickly.
It really does. I mean, just what you just said, Natasha, if we could just slow it down, what you just summarized was an enormous array of highly evocative emotional conflicts around values. One of the things that fell out, what you just said, is when couples have differences in erotic interests or sexual interests, I call those erotic conflicts. And oftentimes some of the sources of erotic conflicts, or one of the elements of an erotic conflict, is a very deeply felt values difference, where each person holds quite dearly the value that is part of that erotic conflict. Too often the value in erotic conflict is addressed by having to choose which side is correct. And
who's right, who's wrong.
Who's right and who's wrong.
Is this moral behavior or is it not?
Yes. I like focusing on, we have a conflict, we have a disagreement, we have a difference. In other circles, we might have, it's against the law. In another circle, we might have, it's immoral, it's against God. Different communities will view these differences through their primary narratives and create painful, painful dilemmas for people. Incredibly painful dilemmas.
Yeah, important to remember too that just because something is against the law doesn't mean that that's necessarily something that we would agree with even now. So for example, interracial sexual relationships were once against the law. I think there are still on the books sodomy laws or things like that I hear about dealing with.
Sodomy laws are also now against the law in all 50 states because of the Supreme Court decision. So those laws were no longer constitutional. Even though they may have not been rescinded from the state, they're not enforceable because the U.S. government overrode those. One other thing I'd like to add about, kind of the narratives you've been inviting us to think about is oftentimes values and these value conflicts or finding shared values, it comes up against pleasure. So in other words, what somebody finds pleasurable, what somebody finds meaningful, enjoyable, fun, there's meaning in pleasure. And that sometimes people are left with what's pleasurable is a conflict with their values.
And so this can happen very much individually. And this is one of the things I want to talk about is even before you start contracting with another person or negotiating with another person, a lot of times the conflict is just within yourself. For example, if there's something that you really enjoy and that's pleasurable, but goes against maybe your religious or cultural norms or values, then right away you have a conflict that can leave you feeling confused or shamed or not sure how to proceed.
I think the other thing is it leaves people often feeling alone, and it leaves people not knowing where to have this discussion, because oftentimes these private personal conflicts between my desires, what I might find pleasurable and enjoyable in any kind of certain sexual activity. If you go to certain places to discuss this conflict, oftentimes the places you go have a predetermined value in which that activity, that pleasure belongs.
Which is very much the case in Mormonism, right? So if you go in and talk to your bishop about how you're looking at pornography or you're masturbating, or even in marital couples who might be using erotic types of materials, you're probably going to get a pretty clear answer that those things are inappropriate. You now have to start a repentance process. It's just kind of the values of that system, is prescribing how people should behave or should not behave.
Yes, that's right. That's right. You're bringing up one of the really painful conflicts, and that's when there's a values conflict, a not shared values between one's attachment with their religion, their faith, their God, and their sexual pleasure, desires, and fantasies.
And this is extremely relevant for LGBT plus folks in our church, so where the only option really to have a relationship with your religion is to be celibate. I mean, we've progressed to the point that we've said, oh, well, maybe same-sex attraction, which is what they're going to call it in Mormonism. They're not going to really validate homosexuality as a term very often. They're going to use same-sex attraction because the value is we're not going to really want people to define themselves by that orientation. And so therefore, maybe we've agreed that that's something that somebody can't control, which that took a while. That was probably about 20, 25 years ago that the church made that distinction. And yet that made no difference as far as the behavioral value that was imposed upon people. So sorry that that's something that you have to deal with in this life, but the behavioral value still stands. You can only have sexual relations with somebody of the opposite sex that you're married to. So we love you. We want you to be part of our association, but we have this very kind of unrealistic set of expectations for you. And if you don't abide by them, now it's pretty harsh. We're going to excommunicate you or discipline you in some way, and even have issues with your children being able to participate. So it's pretty difficult space.
Well, what you're describing is when an institution or a community sexual value system is an act-centered value system. Bill Staten, sex therapist and sex educator, has written about religion and sexual values. And he describes two kinds of value systems that people can kind of align with and systems align with. The most common and the most predominant in all religions, actually, is an act-centered sexual value system, so that certain sex acts are deemed acceptable, moral, and others are not. So that the focus is on the sex act. In the story you just described around same-sex attractions, homosexuality, somebody who might identify as a gender or a sexual relationship diverse identity, what gets focused on is the sex acts they engage in, sexual activity with another person of the same sex or gender. That's an act-centered value system. Most religious circles don't focus on, was the sex consensual? Was it non-exploitive? Were there other kinds of principles involved in the sexual relationship that would be aligned with and consistent with one's faith system? This is a big tension in most religions, is this tension between acts and the focus on sex acts versus moral principles that are standards. And this is really what this whole interview series you're doing with me is founded upon, sexual health principles. So notice how in this configuration, we're not speaking on sex acts. We're not describing a specific thing somebody might sexually be doing. But religions often focus on sex acts as a center for their values.
Right, which is why when I try to open up the paradigm in the discussion, I often say, look, we can have whatever values we want to have. I'm not here to challenge people's values. And at the same time, we need to recognize that there's things like rape happening in a marriage, where you're only having missionary style vanilla sex positions, right? And so that is happening. And you also have college, maybe one night hookups that actually follow all of the sexual principles, where they've been consensual and where they've protected themselves from STIs and pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy. Are concerned about mutual pleasure and all these things that we've been talking about. And so that may not fall into your value system to have a one-night stand in college, and that's fine. But the reality still stands that there are unhealthy sexual relationships within the context of your values, which might be marital sex, if you don't pay attention to these principles.
Yeah.
Which is another thing I wanted to talk to you about is that I think that oftentimes what happens, what gets conflated is if it's a value, especially from God, then there must be science to back that up. And science oftentimes does not back up some of the values that we have within religious or family or cultural circles. So 2 examples I'll give is that I hear a lot is the sex addiction paradigm, right? So that if you look at pornography, because that's evil and debased and goes against my morals and my values, then your brain is going to be damaged for the rest of your life. Our relationship's going to be damaged. It's going to ruin our marriage. You have a propensity to become an addict. That's a very common rhetoric I hear.
Mm-hmm.
Another very common rhetoric I hear is, especially here in evangelical Christianity in Kansas, is if you share yourself with another person, you're going to give a part of yourself that you can't ever get back. If you engage in any type of premarital sex, that there's some damage that really you're having to your emotional psyche. So those are very common myths that make the rounds in these act-centered value systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the values become conflated with fact or science or that kind of thing. Do you want to address that?
You're bringing into the values realm beliefs that have been formed over centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you're describing is the difference between beliefs and values. A belief is a much more complex emotional narrative that's been oftentimes given to us historically from humankind over centuries of literature and stories and family lore and community and culture, all sorts of things. So what we believe can also override our own sexual values. For example, we might believe that to engage in sexual activity outside of a very prescribed circumstance is a contaminant experience. In my trainings, I'll talk about the idea of losing one's virginity, like something's lost.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the way I talk about it is, well, when an infant or a young baby goes from crawling to walking, we don't spend the rest of our lives talking about how much we miss them crawling, that we lost a crawler. I wish they were crawling again. Those were the best years of their lives when they were a crawler. What happened?
I remember when I lost my crawling.
I remember when I lost my crawling. Exactly. Oh, the day they lost their crawling, and they didn't lose their crawling in the right social script. They lost their crawling on a Thursday. They're only supposed to lose their crawling on Tuesdays. We create beliefs around these things, and we call it losing something. So from a sexual health perspective, we don't use the phrase losing virginity because moving towards an adult developmental milestone that we hope all people do, that they move towards the ability to have robust, enjoyable, meaningful, and pleasurable and loving sexual relations. That's what we're working towards. Well, the way you work towards that is you begin to have sexual relations with other people to learn how to do this, because it doesn't fall out of the sky.
Right.
The dilemma is we have beliefs about when what I and others call the sexual debut, the first intercourse, whether it's anal or vaginal. When is that first intercourse supposed to happen? And boy, do we have a lot of ideas about that. And we have no agreement about when and under what circumstances that first intercourse is supposed to happen. So we argue about and create enormous meaning about when that first intercourse happens. And that comes from centuries, millennials, of all sorts of reasons why the meaning of when this first intercourse happens and what it's about. So we have beliefs about first intercourse, and then we have values. What are my values? And this is oftentimes what adolescents and early adults are dealing with, are what are my values about my sexual debut versus what are the beliefs of the people around me.
And once you have a belief yourself versus a value, how would you distinguish between that? In other words, my belief is that sexuality outside of these particular confines is going to be damaging. Therefore, my values develop around a certain type of sexual decisions that I'll make or not make. How would you?
Here's how. Let's get back to the fundamental formula of sexual health. Sexual health is about balancing safety and pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe I need to balance my pleasure with the beliefs that are around me. And there may be a certain amount of pleasure I'm not willing to do without. And I'm willing to have a conflict with my belief system in order to have that pleasure. Or another person might say, those beliefs are so important to me. Those beliefs are so essential to my soul that I'm going to forego some pleasures in order to be aligned and be in good standing with those beliefs. These are decisions, choices that people make when these are in conflict.
Okay. So, for example, if I've got a gay man who says my beliefs are so important that, yes, I will remain celibate, that's his beliefs are that he should, as a gay man, not be having sex with anybody other than a woman. And therefore, that's so important to him that his values now align with those beliefs and he decides to be celibate. Whereas, for example, a couple, maybe I was just working with, getting ready to marry in the temple, they have decided that it's perfectly okay to reach orgasm through any way other than intercourse. That's a bit in conflict, I think, with their belief system that would say, you know, any sexual encounters really are not probably appropriate outside of marriage, but they're okay with that tension, and they've done that together, and they're going to manage that as part of their value to get to the temple with this one particular piece, but not the whole package. Is that kind of what you're
right? They may
getting
say,
at?
a person might say, you know, this pleasure is so important to me that I'm willing to get an A- in aligning with my church values rather than A+.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And that takes some differentiation as well, because if you allow for the authority figure to decide for you, then that's part of your value or belief system as well. So in other words, if this couple was more conflicted about that and they were going in and talking to the bishop about it, and the bishop would say, well, no, you can't reach orgasm at all. It doesn't matter how you do it. And they went home and changed their behavior. That would be their value system would be about allowing this authority to have a say in what they're contracting. Is that a good way?
That may be, and they still may have a values conflict. They may be cooperating, but that doesn't mean they've necessarily altered their values. Their behavior might be aligned with somebody else's values, but they may still be in conflict. I think that's one of the painful parts of it, is their behavior may align with the authority, but that may not be they have shared values. There still may be an interior or a personal conflict that they're really struggling with. For example, I worked with a man who was very much attracted to men and sexual activity and desires for men, and had chosen to not have sex with men for his religious beliefs, but he didn't know what to do with his fantasies, because his sexual life was masturbation, because he was not having sex with a partner. But what he was confused about was, what happens to my fantasies? In order to reach orgasm, I have fantasies and erotic stories and images and all sorts of things about being sexual with men. And he didn't know what that meant to his relationship with God. And this was very painful and difficult for him. And so each time he had an orgasm, he had a conflict with God. Even though he was keeping his behavior aligned with his religious doctrine. So he had his own conflict with God he had to figure out.
Right. Yeah, so this is deeper things. These are things that oftentimes we need to delve into quite a bit. This is not something that you're just having an aha moment on and, oh, now my values are completely aligned with my beliefs and with my acts. And, these are kind of, I think, at the heart, and maybe why I'm excited to talk to you about it is because I think this is where we spend a lot of time in sex therapy, at least I do, talking about these kinds of conflicts, inner conflicts, partnered conflicts, even conflicts with, your outside environment, whether that's, again, your religion, your family, your government.
Yes, it's a source of so much pain. It's a source of so much joy. The emotions are deep and wide. In fact, ASEX Winter Institute starts next Thursday in St. Louis. I'm going to be going to it. It's 3.5 days, and it's about religion and sexuality. And I'm really looking forward to sitting for 3.5 days with specialists from Hindu, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity. There's several other religions as well. They spend 3 hours with each religious system and looking at sexuality related to that religion. And we're going to be doing this for 3.5 days.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating.
And so these conversations, I'm sort of interested in how different religions handle these and organize around handling these values conflicts around pleasure.
Right.
Because I really think that's at the heart of it. At what place does the pursuit and enjoyment of sexual pleasure have within the religious system? And under what circumstances does the religion say you get to fully embrace and surrender and fall into the pleasure of sex?
Yeah, and that's really complex because I think that even in the ideal scenarios, which would be the female-male marriage, as far as ideal in the context of Mormonism, there's still, I think, a lot of questions I get, is oral sex okay? Is anal sex okay? Is looking at erotic images okay? So even in the context of using a sex toy okay, there's so many ideas, I think, about this mythology that correct or righteous sex is very prescribed, even in a marriage, and really limits people's ability to just, like you're saying, do that piece of surrendering, which we know is so important. And so it isn't surprising to me that I deal with so much conflicts like, anorgasmia or erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation or things of that nature that I think is psychologically tied to a lot of these anxious responses of whether or not we're doing it right, even in the context of a male-female marriage.
So the narrative I hear is doing it right, or is it okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what I hear in that is perhaps it's not clear for many people in the Mormon faith where the church's investment in your sexual lives and how it's aligned with scripture and precepts of the faith, and where you have individual autonomy to pursue sexual pleasure. Is the insertion of a dildo in an anus for prostate massage, is that a violation of my Mormon faith? And that it doesn't sound like there's a clear line of where the church has no longer is invested in how you obtain sexual pleasure, and the rest is up to you. And it sounds like that line is not clear. And so the anxiety is the uncertainty of it. Where's the line of my choice versus the church's investment? And it sounds like nobody's helping people understand where that line is. I mean, they're married. It's a heterosexual marriage. They're only having sex with each other. Maybe they're completely aligned with all being a good Mormon. And yet they're interested in whether a finger goes in my vagina or whether a penis goes in my, where does the line stop?
Right. Yeah, and I think this is complex because, of course, as a mental health professional within the faith, I don't want the church to really start deciding for people. And in fact, I think they've done a semi-okay job. I mean, there was the 80s fiasco where they came out with a letter that oral sex was unholy, and that was quickly kind of pushed under the rug. Nobody came out and actually said that they had made a mistake, but after a few weeks, I think it was pretty clear, at least to Bishop.
Well, they found out how many blowjobs were being given in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. There was quite a bit of a backlash to that.
Right. So you see, there's how these boundaries get negotiated, right? Somebody in authority might say, we're invested in this. We're going to make a statement about this. If it's too much of a source of pleasure and people are willing to assert their right to that pleasure, then the institution backs off. It's interesting. It's really interesting.
They definitely did that. I mean, if I've got clients who come into my office who are 40 or older, I'm asking, whether or not they still think that letter is relevant in their marital life. And oftentimes, unfortunately, it is. But if you ask, the 25-year-olds who are just recently married, they're like, what? What are you talking about? We love oral sex. They're all Mormon.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting. But the church, I always talk about this one paragraph that's in the bishop's handbook that is, I'm going to paraphrase it, basically says something like, sexual relationships between a husband and wife are kind of up to them to negotiate. So that's a nice statement. And I quote that often with my couples. At the same time, and I think, again, this was well intended, they said, we do not support any sexual relationship that is coerced, which that's a good thing. So they're addressing coercion. I think maybe the other term is abusive or something like that. So that was good. But then the third word that this is where it gets tricky is or unholy. So who gets to decide what unholy means, right? So if, like some of the things that you mentioned, if we're going to use a dildo, if we're going to have anal play, if we're going to, tie each other up with handcuffs, does that end up in the unholy sphere, even though there's a lot of pleasure? And again, Mormons will, in my office anyway, have a huge spectrum of what that means, whereas some people really only missionary position style sex and zero masturbation or even manual stimulation is what's considered holy sex. Whereas other Mormons are having a lot of fun. They have a sex toy toolbox that they tease about. They have a lot of different ways that they enjoy sexuality together, and they feel perfectly righteous, and holy in the way that they're engaging in their sexuality.
Do you think what you're saying then is that some people take the vagueness of unholy and assert their right to subjectively decide what that means for them because the church is not being clear?
Correct.
Right? So so there's a kind of an invitation for subjectivity.
Yes. And I think two things really contribute to this. One is self-shame. So even if I do find something pleasurable, but I think it's unholy, maybe because my parents told me it was unholy, or, I read that oral sex letter or whatever, then I'm going to be, and these are people who are more rigid in the religion and will live there. I was asked, are you a Diet Coke drinking family or not? Because that gives me a little sense of the type of rigidity you're coming from in Mormonism. But then the other thing I think that happens, which is where I really try to challenge, is back to that point I made about French kissing, is that anything I'm uncomfortable with is unholy. So if I'm uncomfortable with it, and of course the feeling of discomfort must mean it comes from Satan, or it must mean it's evil, or it's not something I should be engaging in, because otherwise why would I be uncomfortable? And so I really try to talk about the many reasons why we deal with discomfort, which can be something is new, something is different, something takes work, something, there's lots of reasons other than it being evil, quote unquote, as to why something might be uncomfortable.
So how do you find people respond to the invitation that the first narrative they came up with for why something was uncomfortable doesn't have to be the last narrative?
Yeah,
are people malleable with that?
I think some are and some aren't, right? And so that's just kind of what I'm negotiating in a room, is trying to, of course, respect people's value systems, respect their meanings around these things that they've come up with, their beliefs, their values, all these things we've been talking about. And at the same time, they're coming to me with a problem that needs probably some creativity or some movement. And so how do we move in those directions without necessarily attacking a person's values, but having more space in that realm, right?
One of the things I like to do with people in this particular kind of situation is there's two threads I'll follow. One thread is, when did you come up with that solution to the dilemma, that this is evil and narrative? This is, that when did you come up with that story? And why are you sticking with it? Why is that story the one you want to stick with? And then the second thing I come up with is, this is where I use my training as a sex therapist. And that people will want to call, let's say they have some desire concerns, I might point out that actually the low desire you're having is not a problem. It's an consequence. It's a natural outcome of your solution to the dilemma. And so we can't give them what I call altered physics. There's the law of physics, and the human sexual response is beholding to the law of physics. So if you have a deeply held shame narrative, such as shame or immoral, really strong, and then you're wondering why you have this particular sexual response concern, low desire, arousal issues, orgasm issues, I think from a sex therapy perspective, we need to help the client see the cause and effect relationship between those two. Mm-hmm. And that's just the way it works, rather than we have magic to take the laws of physics out of your body because as a solution to your dilemma.
Right.
Like, I'll have a guy who has out of control sexual behavior come and see me. And he's beginning to develop a conflict about, let's say I work with a gay man and he's having a conflict about having a sex in public places. And that's no longer what he wants to do. So this is actually a true story, by the way. So he no longer wanted to have sex in public places at all. So months into therapy, for whatever reason, he found himself having sex. It was not within his sexual health plan, but there he was having sex in a public place. He's in group therapy, and he knows that if he crosses a boundary on his sexual health plan, he's going to have to tell the group. So he's in the middle of receiving oral sex from somebody out in public somewhere. And in the middle of oral sex, he thinks, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to tell this to the group. And he stopped the oral sex and pulled up his pants and left. And I call it the pull up the pants moment. In other words, we are constantly navigating pleasure and these values that are our own. And he no longer was finding pleasure in receiving that oral sex in that public place. Well, up a value that said, I don't want to do this anymore. Even though he was engaged in the same behavior, his value had shifted. And so his response to the sexual act and the pleasure was also felt differently. Well, that's just the way sex works. And so when somebody has very rigid or very strong or very devout and important religious values that they are holding close to their heart as essential values, there will be consequences in your sex life. And we can't rescue you from those. We can help you understand them, but we can't arbitrarily make you different as a sexual human being than others because you hold so close to your religious values.
And so is that implying that a shift in religious values is an option? Well, because that's the very difficult work or even idea, or could people say, well, then you're just not respecting my sexual values or my religious values? I mean,
well, this is for the individual to figure out. I think we have to be careful as not having a therapist advise in some sort of direction here. That would be the error, because then the client can just object to your advice. This is the client's problem, not the therapist. So I had a man come and see me many years ago who was very much in the Mormon faith. And he wanted to be diagnosed as a sex addict so that he could remain a Mormon, because he was having sex with men in these kind of anonymous. And he went to the bishop and talked about it. And the bishop said, well, get a diagnosis of sex addiction. And then you can remain in good standing in the Mormon church, because that sex behavior with men is your sex addiction. That's a disease. But if that meant he was attracted to men and he was actually wanting to be with men, then he couldn't be a Mormon anymore. So he wanted to stay attached to the Mormon faith. It was the most essential and important relationship in his life, was being a Mormon.
Right.
And so he needed that diagnosis of sex addiction to not lose the attachment for the most important relationship in his life.
Yeah. Yeah, which is right back to what we started with, which is why this is so painful, because you've got your own personal system, your anatomy, your biology, the things that kind of naturally, like you said, erotic templates or tastes, right, that kind of just happen for a lot of different reasons. They're just kind of there. And then on the next layer is, what are your beliefs? And the next layer is what your values are. All of those things. I mean, if they're aligned, then woohoo, right? And on top of it, if you have a partner where it's fairly familiar, similarly aligned, then off you go. But there's so many moving parts there that it's difficult for all of those things to be aligned, both internally and then, of course, in partnered relationships.
And what I think is the most painful part of these values being misaligned is we live in a culture here in this country that says it is an acceptable solution to misalign sexual values and dissolve the family.
Mm-hmm.
It is an acceptable solution to misalign values and remove you from a church.
Mm-hmm.
These are acceptable solutions. I call it the severing response.
Mm-hmm.
This severing response is an acceptable solution to these dilemmas when they're intransigent. And not all cultures embrace the severing response in the same way. In some cultures, that severing response is repudiated more, is thought of as less acceptable of a solution. It's seen more of a failure than it is a righteous choice. But in our culture, the severing response, divorcing somebody over a sexual indiscretion, having children be raised in a divorced home, a whole family system be severed because of a sexual act, is an acceptable solution to that behavior in this culture.
And not even just acceptable. I think in many ways, it's like you're stupid if you don't do that. So it's almost like you're shamed if you put up with sexual acts that somehow haven't been contracted, right? Put up with, right? Quote unquote, or that somehow you're an enabler or that you are not strong enough to stand up for yourself. So that's a lot of pressure on somebody who's dealing maybe with infidelity or has been betrayed in some way to navigate their own feelings, ideas. And I know in Mormonism, we have that constant thing, especially towards men, that now they've lost their worthiness to hold the priesthood powers. So do you really want to be married to somebody who doesn't have this priesthood in your, and gives you the blessings of the priesthood in your home? So I see that a lot as far as, well, then I must divorce you. And what's really heartbreaking is when I ask questions like, well, tell me about the rest of your marriage, tell me about your parenting style, tell me about your financial style. And all those things seem to be pretty okay. They like how they co-parent. They have similar financial goals. They have, acquired a lot of assets together. But this one particular thing can be used justifiably in a lot of people's belief systems that this is dangerous enough or threatening enough or whatever it is to sever the relationship, like you mentioned. So
Yeah.
I totally second that concern.
So then we have the people who their values are to try to protect the attachment, protect the family unit, even though a behavior has happened that has injured somebody deeply, is the kind of holding the frame of the family, holding the frame of the marriage. We're going to try to get through this heavy, stormy sea because there's a bigger picture here of a longer arc of life we're hoping for. When somebody chooses that, there's going to be a lot of stigma attached from others for them making that choice.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, it also reminds me how, because family values are so important in Mormonism, and because there's so much fear attached to that concern that any one sexual act or even thought or propensity or orientation could ruin that, we go back to the principle of honesty. I think this is a highly motivating reason to not be completely honest with your partner, because the value of the family entity staying intact overrides the honesty principle.
I can't remember if we've done one of our conversations on that principle yet.
Yes, we have. That was our last one.
Okay, good. You're right. This is why these are 6 principles of sexual health, and that an attempt to navigate one principle can at times conflict with aligning with one of the other principles. And that's why these are interacting network of principles, and how complicated this choreography is, and why just being focused on these 6 principles of sexual health can help, I believe, organize the complexity of the emotions and the context and cultural context of these difficult to navigate sexual conflicts. Let's first just organize the whole situation around these 6 principles and see what we can make of it by keeping the conversation focused there. Look at how we've been able to navigate many, many complex issues that you've described in the Mormon faith and the Mormon communities by just keeping the conversation around values.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other things we could have, people can get off into, but I think that's where these principled conversations can help people hold the conversation when the feelings are so intense, the emotions are so strong and deep and visceral that there's not a thinking brain that they can help balance that out with. And I think the principles help balance those conversations when the emotions are so strong and powerful.
Yeah. Well, so as we close up this particular interview, I do want to touch on back to just your thoughts about 2 things. One is this assumption, I think, that sometimes we share values that couples might get into. So you're Mormon, I'm Mormon, we must have the same values.
Right. That, in my trainings that I do for the professionals, I tell basically the same story. The 2 adolescents are kind of all excited. They're a new couple and we're teaching them about the principles, and they're like 17 and, oh, we've got that shared values one down perfect. Wow, really? How'd you do that? Well, we just go to the same church.
Right.
And it's like, case closed, done. Right.
Right.
So I'm with you on that one. That's real shorthand for avoiding this whole territory.
Yeah. Exactly. And that, well, you know what they say when you assume things, right? And so you have to kind of just understand that you come from, even like I've mentioned many times, the spectrum of Mormonism is wide. And I see that in my office all the time, as far as people who are more on the flexible side of things, more on the rigid side of things, more orthodox, more nuanced, all of those things. So so not assuming that you have the same sexual values, that you have to still negotiate, you still have to communicate, you still have to have a lot of dialogue. And back to your first sentence, I think that you said, which is about meaning. What meaning are we attributing to these different sexual acts or sexual values that we have? And then back to the pathology, I think it's very easy to pathologize people because they don't share your sexual value. Back to that idea of disgust that you mentioned. So if I'm disgusted by it, well, then we don't say, well, I'm just disgusted by that. We say,
that's my feeling. That's my feeling. I'm disgusted. No, you're sick.
You're sick. You're perverse. There's something wrong with you, right? Or something wrong with me, because we can be disgusted with our own ideas or pleasures, or
yes, that's right.
So that's any thoughts about those two things, about sharing values and how we pathologize each other when we don't?
Well, I want to go with the pathology one because I think this is really pertinent for people who seek out mental health resources for these conflicts around values, is that the mental health field in particular has aligned itself at times with providing a psychiatric diagnosis to explain certain sexual behaviors that have been highly contentious. At one time, homosexuality was a disease.
That's right.
So that was a way to explain it. Transgender, the experience of identifying as not a cisgendered person, was seen as a disease. By status, that was a disorder. And what's been interesting about the psychiatric profession around their psychosexual disorder diagnosis is when they've been so certain about these diagnoses, they've had to eventually back away that they were wrong. And so what I call sort of premature evaluation, this movement to giving something a diagnosis, giving something a label, giving something a pathology, is a common solution to these dilemmas. And so families and couples will want this disease. They want that pathology because it resolves or simplifies the religious conflict.
Kind of like your bishop's example. Well, if you're sick,
right?
If I'm your spouse and you're sick, well, I vowed to stay with you in sickness or in health, right? Versus if you're a jerk.
Right. Well, actually, if we go back in history, it wasn't that they were jerks. They were degenerates.
Yes, right.
And so disease rescued people, the psychosexual disorders rescued people from being degenerates, even though it was the same behavior. And so now we're in the dilemma of finding that sexual science is not supporting these disease configurations for some psychosexual disorders. And where does that now leave religious people, where this disease has been very meaningful and helpful for them in resolving their dilemma?
Right.
Because their church systems don't offer them another avenue for resolving this if it's not a disease. If it's not a disease, you're a degenerate. You're immoral. You're a sinner. I mean, those are the options we have. Religious systems, I think, are going to be faced with either evolving or having some very significant dilemmas ahead if they don't offer an alternative when the psychiatric profession starts taking away these psychosexual disorders that really help them resolve these problems.
Right. Yes. Amen. I think that that's a very important point and something that we're all going to be wrestling with and have been wrestling with for years. And I think it's a good wrestle to have. So
I do too. We need to have the conversation. And I tell people, Natasha, that I've been doing these series of interviews with you. People are fascinated. Why are you, this is what they say. Why are you talking to them? Like I'm some sort of heretic.
You're a degenerate.
I'm serious. I get that response, Natasha. Like, I'm a heretic for talking to a Mormon therapist in conversations about sexuality. It's fascinating. I am fascinated by this response.
Interesting, yeah.
And I look at them and I say, do you know what interesting conversation we're having? Do you know how we cover ground that it makes me a better thinker.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you're sticking in here with my digital self.
But I just find it's interesting that we have mirror experiences based on certain people who are aligned with us, and me in the sexual health world and you in the Mormon world. And there can be this sense of like, we're not supposed to be talking to each other.
Right. Well, imagine what it's like to actually be a certified sex therapist in the Mormon world. So yeah, that.
There's a great Netflix show on that one. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I'll say how much I've had to shift in my beliefs and how much I've had to challenge coming from the systems that I've come from, and still very much wanting to hold on to the very positive aspects of my religion and my faith and, my traditions and my culture and my tribe, all of those things matter so much to me. And yet from very early in my career, one of the first cases I got as a greenie was mixed orientation couple, and how they had gone to a non-Mormon therapist and basically had been told, this is probably not going to work. You probably want to prepare for divorce. And so they completely rejected that because of their value system around family. They were very good friends. They loved me very much. And we started a journey together that I would say was really the beginning of my real education around, and it's sad, when your clients have to educate you, because of course we can't learn everything in the 2 years of a master's degree program. And especially this topic was not really something that was broached in my training. Sexuality in general is not very often broached in professional training, much less mixed orientation. So of course I had resources from my church that they were giving me, which felt really unethical to me. And then there were, of course, what my clients' desires were. And then there was my own conflict that was beginning as far as what does this mean? And what does it mean for this couple? What does it mean for me professionally? What does then that mean for my own personal beliefs? So it's been quite the journey, 20 years later, to be sitting here with you, and why I have many of the ideas that I have and the propensity to want to talk about these things, because it's just so painful to have to go through that on your own or not feel like you have very many resources to do that. So I think we're in a much better place in general in our field, and with supervision, with resources I didn't have 20 years ago. But think of the people out there who might be listening to this conversation that we've been having, that this didn't exist 20 years ago for you, and where you were and what you were faced with. And I just applaud you for creating these conversations and spaces for people to not be so alone, and they're not having to figure this out on their own like you were 20 years ago. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Well, bring us home with your closing thoughts on shared values.
You can't have sex without meaning.
Yeah.
Don't try. Don't try to have sex without meaning.
Don't be a dolphin.
Yeah, right. Well, dolphins probably enjoy sex, but it's a very different experience. We can't separate the fact that sex has meaning for us. We can't be in conflict with the fact that sex has meaning. We have to figure out how the meaning of sex allows us to remain with our pleasure and within the safety and confines of sexual health. We get our whole lifetime to figure this one out.
Thank you, Doug. So I'm very excited for our next principle, which is like the icing on the cake, mutual pleasure.
I'm glad we saved that one for last.
That will be a lot of fun. And I think we've talked about possibly doing even one right after all of the principles have been discussed, just to kind of talk about when those principles are not necessarily met in ideal ways, or different, more complex situations where people are struggling to align all 6 of those values in ways that fit in their day-to-day lives in pretty complex situations. So we're nearing the end of our series, but this has been just fabulous. And thank you so much for this discussion and being willing to talk to the Mormon lady. And
oh, but you're so much more than that, Natasha.
That's right. That's right. And we'll see you next time then.
Okay, thanks.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.